My name is Elena Carter. I'm 32 years old, and 14 years ago, my own mother stood in the middle of our church fellowship hall during Easter dinner and told everyone I was adopted because she needed to hide an affair that could have destroyed her marriage, her reputation, and the perfect image she had spent years building in our small town of Asheville, North Carolina. And for a long time, I actually believed her story because when you hear something repeated enough by your own family, eventually your brain stops fighting it and starts accepting it as truth even when every instinct inside you says something feels wrong. I still remember the exact moment she said it, because my little cousin Emma accidentally knocked over a glass pitcher of sweet tea onto the tablecloth. Everyone laughed nervously, and my mother suddenly looked directly at me with this strange, cold expression before saying, "Well, at least Elena isn't biologically related to us, so maybe clumsiness runs in her real family." And the room became silent so fast that I could literally hear the old ceiling fan turning above us, while my father stared down at his plate without saying a single word. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand something about my mother because people like her don't destroy lives in one dramatic moment. They do it slowly, carefully, over years, through tiny humiliations and calculated lies that make everyone question the victim instead of the liar. My mother, Diane Carter, was one of the most respected women in our county, a real estate broker who donated money to charity events, led church fundraisers, and constantly lectured people about honesty and family values, while secretly controlling every person around her through fear and guilt. And if you challenged her publicly, she could switch from smiling Southern hospitality to emotional cruelty in seconds without even raising her voice. My younger brother Mason was the golden child, the athlete, the boy who could do absolutely nothing wrong, while I became the family embarrassment overnight after that Easter dinner, because once the adoption story spread through town, people started treating me differently, including teachers, neighbors, and even some relatives who suddenly acted like I was an outsider invading their family instead of someone who had grown up there my entire life. But here's what they didn't know at the time, and honestly what I didn't know either. My mother's story was never about adoption at all. It was about protecting herself from a secret so ugly that if the truth came out back then, her marriage would have collapsed instantly and half the town would have looked at her very differently. The rumors started growing within days because in small towns people treat gossip like entertainment. And by the time school started again after spring break, kids were whispering behind my back, asking who my real parents were, while teachers gave me these uncomfortable pity looks that made me feel even worse. And one afternoon, my history teacher, Mrs. Palmer, quietly asked if I needed counseling services because she assumed I must be emotionally unstable after learning the truth about my identity, even though nobody had bothered asking me if any of it was actually true. Wait until you hear what my mother did next, because the adoption lie alone apparently wasn't enough for her. Over the next several months, she started rewriting my entire childhood story in front of people, claiming I had always struggled with emotional problems, anger issues, and feelings of abandonment. And the scary part was how believable she sounded because she mixed tiny pieces of truth into massive lies the way manipulators always do. If I cried after being bullied at school, she called me emotionally dramatic. If I defended myself against insults from relatives, she told people adopted children often suffered from identity confusion. If I got quiet during family gatherings, she'd sigh sadly and say I was probably wondering about my real mother. I had no idea back then that every lie she told was carefully designed to make one future revelation impossible for people to believe. My father barely spoke during those years, and that silence hurt almost more than my mother's cruelty, because every time I looked at him, I kept hoping he would finally stand up for me. But instead, he buried himself in work at his accounting office and avoided conflict completely, while my brother Mason learned quickly that agreeing with Mom made his own life easier, so he laughed at the jokes, repeated the rumors, and acted embarrassed to even be seen with me at school. By 17, I felt completely alone in my own home, and the worst part was, I still didn't know why any of this was happening to me. I thought maybe I really was unwanted. Maybe I really didn't belong there. Maybe something about me deserved all the rejection I was receiving. But 14 years later, a single DNA test would expose every lie my mother ever told, destroy the reputation she protected for decades, and reveal a secret that even my father never saw coming. The breaking point in my relationship with my family didn't happen during one huge screaming match, like people imagine when they hear stories like mine. It happened through hundreds of small humiliations stacked on top of each other, until one day I realized there was nothing left inside me except exhaustion. And by the summer of 2012, I had become a ghost inside my own house, quietly avoiding family dinners, spending extra hours at school just to stay away from home, and pretending I was fine whenever teachers or friends asked questions because admitting the truth out loud somehow felt even more embarrassing than living through it. At the time, I was 18 years old, working part-time at a grocery store on Merriman Avenue while trying to save money for community college applications. And every single paycheck somehow disappeared into family expenses because my mother insisted that since I wasn't technically their biological child, they had already done more than enough for me financially, which meant I paid for my own clothes, school supplies, phone bill, and even groceries half the time, while my younger brother Mason drove a brand new silver Mustang that my parents bought him for his 16th birthday. Before I tell you about the night I finally left home, you need to understand how deeply my mother controlled the people around her, because even relatives who privately suspected she was being cruel still obeyed her publicly out of fear of becoming her next target. And that included my Aunt Rebecca, who once secretly pulled me aside after church and whispered that none of this felt right to her before immediately apologizing the next day because my mother somehow found out about the conversation. That was the terrifying thing about Diane Carter. She always knew everything, every conversation, every private opinion, every tiny disagreement, and people learned very quickly that opposing her came with consequences. Around that same time, I became close friends with a girl named Natalie who worked with me at the grocery store bakery section, and she was honestly one of the first people who treated me like a normal human being instead of some damaged outsider. But even that friendship became another weapon for my mother, because whenever Natalie came over, she would casually tell embarrassing stories about my behavioral issues as a child, or joke about how adopted kids always look for attention. And I could see the confusion on Natalie's face because none of those stories matched the person she actually knew. One night after work, Natalie finally asked me directly if I had ever seen adoption papers or met any social worker connected to my case. And the question hit me so hard, I couldn't even answer because the truth was, I had never seen any proof whatsoever. Just my mother's word repeated endlessly until everyone accepted it as fact. But here's what I still didn't know back then. My mother panicked anytime someone started asking logical questions, because logical questions were dangerous to her entire story. The situation became even worse during my senior year graduation because my mother somehow turned what should have been one of the happiest days of my life into another performance about herself. And I'll never forget standing in my cap and gown outside Asheville High School while parents took photos with their kids and my mother loudly told another family, "We're proud of Elena, despite all the emotional struggles she inherited from her biological background," while my father stood beside her, staring silently at the pavement again, like always. I remember looking around at all the other students hugging their families and suddenly realizing I felt completely disconnected from the people standing next to me. Even strangers looked more emotionally connected than we did. A few weeks later, things exploded completely during a 4th of July barbecue at my uncle's lake house outside Hendersonville. And honestly, that night changed the direction of my entire life because my mother had been drinking wine for hours and started making jokes about me in front of relatives again. Except this time, my cousin Tyler asked a question she clearly wasn't expecting. He laughed and said, "Honestly, Aunt Diane, Elena looks exactly like Grandpa William when he was younger. Are you sure she's adopted?" The silence afterward was immediate and terrifying because for the first time in years, my mother genuinely looked afraid, not angry, not annoyed, afraid. She snapped at Tyler so aggressively that everyone became uncomfortable. Then she grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises and dragged me inside the house, where she accused me of manipulating people against her even though I hadn't said a single word. That night, she screamed at me for almost 2 straight hours, telling me I ruined her life, destroyed family harmony, and made everyone suspicious of her. And in the middle of that argument, she accidentally said something I would never forget. She pointed at me with this look of pure hatred and shouted, "You should have never looked so much like him." Then she froze instantly, like she realized what she had just revealed. But by then it was too late, because for the first time I understood something horrifying. My mother wasn't hiding who my parents were. She was hiding who my father was. I barely slept that night, and the next morning, after another vicious argument where she called me ungrateful and unstable, I packed 2 duffel bags with clothes, my old laptop, $312 in cash, and a framed photo of my grandmother who had died years earlier before all the lies started. Then I walked out of that house while my mother stood in the driveway telling neighbors I was having one of my episodes again. My father watched me leave from the kitchen window and never once tried to stop me. I spent my first night alone sleeping on Natalie's apartment floor, wondering how a person survives after losing their entire family. But what I didn't realize then was that leaving home would eventually save my life. Because 14 years later, the same secret my mother destroyed me to protect would become the reason her entire world collapsed in front of everyone she spent years manipulating. The first year after leaving home was honestly the hardest period of my entire life because people love telling inspirational stories about independence and starting over. But the reality is far uglier when you're 18 years old with barely any money, no emotional support system, and years of psychological damage that make you question your own worth every single day. And during those first months, I worked so many exhausting shifts between the grocery store and a late-night diner near Interstate 26 that I sometimes slept only 3 or 4 hours before starting again the next morning. Natalie let me stay in her apartment temporarily, but she was only 20 herself and struggling financially too. So I spent most nights feeling guilty for taking up space while desperately trying to figure out how to survive long-term without becoming dependent on anyone else. Before I tell you how my life slowly started changing, you need to understand something important because this part matters later. Despite everything my mother did to me, I still secretly wanted her approval for years after leaving home. And that's the part people don't understand about emotionally abusive families, because even after they destroy your confidence, you still crave tiny moments of love from them, like a starving person begging for crumbs. I checked my phone constantly, hoping my father would finally call and apologize, or that my mother would admit she went too far. But instead, the only messages I received came from relatives forwarding passive-aggressive comments about forgiveness, respect, and family unity, while carefully ignoring the actual reasons I left. My brother Mason didn't contact me once during that entire first year except for a single drunk voicemail after one of his football parties where he laughed and said, "Mom says you're probably off searching for your real family now," before hanging up. At the time, that voicemail crushed me emotionally. But years later, it would become evidence of how deeply my mother poisoned everyone around her. Around October of 2012, I finally enrolled in Asheville Buncombe Technical Community College because one of my old English teachers, Mrs. Ramirez, helped me apply for emergency financial aid after noticing I was falling asleep in class from exhaustion. And to this day, I still believe teachers can save lives without even realizing it, because that woman spent hours helping me rewrite scholarship essays while reminding me repeatedly that my situation did not define my intelligence or future. But here's what my mother never expected. Once I was physically separated from her constant manipulation, people started seeing me differently. My professors described me as hardworking, focused, and calm. Co-workers trusted me with responsibilities. Friends actually enjoyed being around me. Slowly, I began realizing maybe I wasn't unstable or emotionally damaged after all. Maybe I had simply spent my entire life trapped inside someone else's lie. During my second year of college, I met Professor Daniel Harper, a business instructor who previously worked in corporate finance before teaching, and he became another major turning point in my life because after reading one of my class presentations, he encouraged me to apply for a state university transfer program that I initially believed was impossible for someone like me financially. But Daniel kept pushing me harder than anyone ever had before, telling me that surviving difficult environments often creates extraordinary resilience if people learn how to channel it properly. By 2015, I transferred to the University of North Carolina at Charlotte studying business administration while balancing internships and night shifts. And for the first time in my life, I started building something that belonged entirely to me instead of constantly defending myself against accusations and humiliation. I rented a tiny apartment with terrible plumbing, drove a used Honda Civic with nearly 200,000 miles on it, and ate instant noodles more times than I can count. But emotionally, I felt freer than I ever had living in that beautiful, expensive house with my parents. Wait until you hear what happened 3 years later, because this is where karma slowly started moving toward my mother, without any of us realizing it yet. In 2018, I got hired as a junior operations coordinator at a medical supply company in Charlotte called Sterling Biotech Solutions, and although the starting salary was only $58,000 a year, to me it felt unbelievable because nobody in my family had ever expected me to become successful at anything. Meanwhile, through social media and occasional relatives, I learned my mother continued telling people I had abandoned the family due to unresolved adoption trauma, and apparently most people still believed her because she controlled the narrative completely back home. But the bigger surprise came from my father because despite years of silence, he suddenly started emailing me short, awkward messages every few months asking generic questions about work and weather without ever addressing the actual past. And at first, I ignored him completely because I didn't trust his motives. But eventually, curiosity made me respond politely, even though emotionally I kept him at a distance. Something about his emails felt strange, almost nervous, like he wanted to ask something important, but couldn't bring himself to do it. Around that same period, my company promoted me twice within 2 years after I helped restructure a failing logistics division that ended up saving nearly $800,000 annually. And suddenly the same kind of people who once ignored me began treating me with respect, including extended relatives who somehow found my LinkedIn profile and started congratulating me publicly online despite barely speaking to me for years. My mother, however, stayed completely silent. No congratulations, no apology, nothing. Looking back now, I think she was terrified because every year I became more financially stable, emotionally independent, and confident, which meant every year I also became harder to control. And what she feared most wasn't losing me. It was losing control over the story she created 14 years earlier, because hidden underneath that story was a truth so devastating that once DNA evidence finally exposed it, her marriage, reputation, and entire identity would shatter almost overnight. By 2020, my life looked completely different from the frightened 18-year-old girl who slept on a friend's apartment floor with 2 duffel bags and $300 to her name, because at 30 years old, I had become Regional Operations Director at Sterling Biotech Solutions, overseeing 3 southeastern distribution centers, managing over 90 employees, and earning more money annually than either of my parents ever had combined. But the strange thing about trauma is that success doesn't erase it the way people think it does, because no matter how many promotions I received or achievements I collected, there was still a part of me that froze every time someone mentioned family, childhood memories, or resemblance between parents and children. I built a carefully controlled life in Charlotte, filled with work, routines, and professional goals, because structure felt safer than emotional vulnerability. And although I had close friends by then, including Natalie, who remained like a sister to me, my co-worker Jasmine, who constantly forced me out of my comfort zone socially, and my mentor Daniel Harper, who still checked in regularly, I avoided romantic relationships almost completely because trusting people deeply still felt dangerous after spending my formative years inside constant manipulation and emotional humiliation. Before I tell you how my mother unexpectedly re-entered my life, you need to understand something important about public image because people like Diane Carter survive through appearances more than truth. And around that time, social media had made reputation management even easier for manipulative people since they could carefully curate perfect family photos and inspirational quotes while hiding what actually happened behind closed doors. My mother became locally famous online for her real estate business and community charity events, constantly posting captions about motherhood, integrity, and family loyalty while people flooded the comments calling her an inspiration. And every time I accidentally saw those posts, I felt physically sick because nobody there knew the reality underneath that polished image. But here's what she didn't know. The internet also made it easier for people to reconnect, compare stories, and notice inconsistencies. Around late 2020, my cousin Tyler, the same cousin who accidentally questioned my resemblance to Grandpa William years earlier, contacted me privately through Facebook after almost a decade of silence, and his message changed everything. He told me several relatives had started quietly questioning my mother's adoption story because too many details never made sense, including the fact that no one had ever seen adoption records, baby photos from another family, or legal paperwork. And according to Tyler, even my late grandmother had apparently argued with my mother repeatedly before her death about telling the truth before it destroys the family. Reading that message felt like someone suddenly opened a locked door inside my brain, because for years I convinced myself maybe I exaggerated parts of my childhood due to pain and resentment. But Tyler's words confirmed something I secretly feared all along. Other people had noticed the lies too. A few weeks later, my father called me unexpectedly for the first time in nearly 8 years, and I almost didn't answer because seeing his name appear on my phone triggered instant anxiety. But something inside me said this conversation mattered. His voice sounded older, weaker somehow, and after awkward small talk, he finally admitted he and my mother were having serious marriage problems because she had become increasingly paranoid, controlling, and obsessed with protecting certain family secrets, though he refused to explain further over the phone. Then he said something that genuinely shocked me. He quietly asked if I would ever consider taking a DNA test with him someday, just for peace of mind. I remember sitting frozen in my apartment kitchen staring at the wall because hearing those words from my father felt surreal after years of silence and denial. I asked him directly why he suddenly doubted the adoption story after defending it my entire life, and there was this long, painful silence before he answered, "Because your mother never let me see the paperwork either." That sentence haunted me for weeks afterward. Wait until you hear what happened next, because this is where my mother's carefully constructed world started cracking publicly for the first time. In spring 2021, my company hosted a major healthcare logistics conference in Atlanta, where industry leaders, investors, and medical executives attended networking events over several days, and because of my recent promotion, I was one of the featured speakers, discussing operational efficiency during supply shortages caused by the pandemic. The event itself went incredibly well, but afterward, one of the attendees approached me near the hotel ballroom and introduced herself as Karen Whitmore, a retired nurse originally from Asheville, who claimed she recognized me immediately from childhood. At first, the conversation seemed harmless until she casually mentioned remembering all the gossip years ago about my adoption before suddenly stopping herself mid-sentence with a strange expression. Then she looked directly at me and said, "You know, your mother used to bring you into the pediatric clinic constantly when you were a baby because people kept commenting how much you looked like your father's side of the family." My heart practically stopped. Karen became visibly uncomfortable after realizing what she had revealed, but the damage was already done because her statement completely contradicted the story I had heard my entire life. According to my mother, I entered the family through a private adoption process at almost 2 years old, yet this retired nurse remembered me as an infant who already resembled the Carter family physically. That single conversation shattered whatever uncertainty remained in my mind. For the first time in 14 years, I stopped asking whether my mother lied and started asking why she lied so aggressively. I spent the next several months quietly researching DNA testing companies, old medical records, and public legal databases while trying to prepare myself emotionally for answers I might not want to hear. Because deep down, I sensed the truth wasn't just painful, it was explosive. And once that truth finally surfaced through scientific evidence, my mother wouldn't be able to manipulate, intimidate, or emotionally control anyone into silence ever again. By early 2022, the questions surrounding my identity had consumed so much of my mental energy that I could barely focus outside work because every new detail uncovered another contradiction in my mother's story. And once you start pulling apart a lie that has existed for 14 years, you begin realizing how many people either ignored obvious red flags or intentionally avoided asking questions, because accepting the truth would have forced them to confront their own silence and complicity. I became obsessive about timelines, documents, and memories, spending nights at my apartment surrounded by notebooks filled with dates, family events, screenshots of old social media posts, and handwritten notes from conversations with relatives who suddenly seemed much more willing to talk now that distance and time had weakened my mother's influence over them. Before I tell you about the DNA test itself, you need to understand the emotional conflict happening inside me because despite everything, there was still a terrified part of me afraid the test would somehow confirm my mother's version of events and prove I truly didn't belong anywhere. And that fear sounds irrational now, but children raised through manipulation often internalize lies so deeply that even objective evidence feels emotionally dangerous. During that period, my friend Jasmine practically forced me to stop isolating myself because she noticed I was becoming withdrawn and paranoid, constantly replaying childhood memories, searching for clues. And one night, after too many glasses of wine, she bluntly told me something nobody had ever said before. She looked directly at me across her kitchen table and said, "Elena, normal mothers don't spend 14 years publicly humiliating their daughters unless they're hiding something massive." Hearing someone state it so plainly hit me harder than I expected, because I had spent years analyzing my mother's behavior emotionally, while Jasmine saw it immediately from an outsider's perspective. None of it was normal. Around the same time, my father started calling more frequently, though our conversations remained painfully awkward, because decades of silence don't disappear overnight. And eventually, he admitted he had secretly doubted my mother's story for years, but convinced himself not to investigate because he feared destroying the family publicly. I remember becoming furious hearing that confession, because while he protected family appearances, I carried the emotional consequences alone for 14 years. And for the first time in my life, I directly confronted him about his cowardice. I asked him how he could watch his daughter get humiliated publicly, isolated emotionally, and treated like an outsider without once demanding proof. And honestly, I think that conversation finally broke something inside him because he started crying quietly before admitting he believed my mother manipulated him from the beginning. But here's what neither of us understood yet. My mother's lie wasn't only about an affair. It was also about protecting the identity of another man entirely. A few weeks later, my father agreed to take a private DNA test with me through a national laboratory service in Charlotte, and I cannot properly explain the emotional tension of sitting inside that sterile office, watching a technician swab our cheeks while both of us avoided eye contact, because deep down, we already sensed our lives were about to change permanently. The technician probably thought we were just another father and daughter confirming ancestry information, but for me it felt like 14 years of confusion, humiliation, and emotional abuse narrowing into one terrifying moment of truth. Afterward, the waiting period lasted almost 3 weeks, and those weeks were honestly unbearable because every possible outcome replayed constantly in my mind, while old memories suddenly looked different under the possibility that my mother fabricated everything. I started remembering small details I ignored as a teenager, like how relatives occasionally commented on my resemblance to Grandpa William before awkwardly changing the subject, or how my mother became visibly angry anytime anyone compared my facial features to my father's side of the family. Then another shocking detail emerged through my Aunt Rebecca, who finally contacted me privately after years of silence. She admitted my mother had once accused my father of cheating shortly before the adoption story suddenly appeared. And according to Rebecca, several relatives privately suspected my mother invented the adoption narrative to redirect attention away from problems inside her own marriage. Wait until you hear what happened the day the DNA results arrived, because nothing in my life prepared me for that moment. It was raining heavily outside Charlotte on April 17th, 2022, when I received an email notification saying our laboratory results were available online. And I remember sitting frozen at my office desk, staring at the screen while my hands shook so badly I could barely type the password. My father happened to be driving to Charlotte that day because we agreed to review the results together in person. But curiosity overwhelmed me before he arrived, and I opened the report alone. The first thing I saw was a highlighted sentence confirming with 99.998% certainty that Robert Carter was my biological father. I stared at those words for what felt like forever because suddenly 14 years of humiliation collapsed instantly under scientific proof. I wasn't adopted. I had never been adopted. My mother knowingly lied to everyone. But the second part of the report changed everything even more dramatically, because alongside the paternity confirmation was an additional genetic note flagging an unusually high probability of biological relation between me and another individual already present in the database through extended family matching. That individual's name was Ethan Holloway. I had never heard the name before, but after further analysis and assistance from the genetic counselor connected to the testing company, we discovered something horrifying. Ethan Holloway was likely my half-brother through my mother. In other words, years before inventing the adoption lie, my mother had another child connected to an affair she successfully hid from almost everyone. And somehow that secret connected directly to why she spent years publicly destroying me emotionally. When my father arrived and saw the results himself, he looked physically sick. He kept repeating the same sentence over and over again. She lied to all of us. But the worst part came hours later when we confronted my Aunt Rebecca by phone and she finally admitted the truth she had hidden for decades. My mother had an affair shortly before I was born, panicked that people would discover it, and after I inherited strong physical traits from my father's side instead of hers. She eventually invented the adoption story years later to redirect suspicion away from herself. But what she never anticipated was modern DNA testing exposing every hidden connection publicly. And within days, that exposure would completely destroy the reputation she spent her entire adult life protecting. The week after the DNA results came back felt less like reality and more like watching someone slowly detonate a bomb that had been buried underneath our family for decades. Because once the truth finally surfaced, every lie my mother told started collapsing one after another with terrifying speed. And the most shocking part was how many people immediately changed their behavior the moment scientific evidence replaced rumors and emotional manipulation. My father stayed in Charlotte for several days after we received the results because emotionally he was completely unraveling, and honestly, I had never seen him look genuinely broken before that point, because throughout my childhood, he survived conflict by avoiding it, staying quiet, pretending problems would disappear if ignored long enough. But now, there was no escape left, because DNA evidence had confirmed not only that I was his biological daughter, but also that my mother deliberately destroyed my identity for 14 years to protect herself. Before I tell you about the confrontation that destroyed her public image permanently, you need to understand how desperate my mother became once she realized control was slipping away, because manipulative people rarely confess when exposed. They escalate, deny, rewrite history, and attack harder than ever. And Diane Carter did all four almost immediately. The first thing she did after my father confronted her privately was accuse him of emotionally abusing her during their marriage and claim she created the adoption story because she feared he would abandon the family after her affair years earlier. But even that explanation kept changing every few hours depending on who she spoke to, and relatives quickly started noticing inconsistencies because panic makes liars careless. According to my Aunt Rebecca, my mother spent 2 straight days calling family members trying to convince them I forged the DNA results somehow, which honestly would have sounded ridiculous under normal circumstances, except many people in town had trusted her blindly for decades. But here's what she still didn't understand. Facts are much harder to manipulate once multiple people start comparing information together. Around that same period, Ethan Holloway, the possible half-brother identified through the Ancestry database, finally contacted me directly after the testing company facilitated communication permissions between us, and I remember staring at his message for nearly 10 minutes before responding, because suddenly this abstract genetic discovery became a real person with a life, memories, and questions of his own. Ethan was 36 years old, lived outside Knoxville, Tennessee, and had spent most of his life believing his biological father abandoned his mother before he was born. But after reviewing shared DNA markers and timelines with his own relatives, he realized my mother's name matched stories he overheard growing up about a married woman involved with his father decades earlier. Reading those details made my stomach turn because it meant my mother didn't simply make one terrible mistake years ago. She built an entire identity around covering it up afterward while sacrificing everyone around her emotionally to maintain control. Ethan and I eventually spoke through video call, and the emotional experience was honestly surreal because for the first time in my life I was looking at someone whose facial expressions, smile, and even voice patterns resembled mine in strange, subtle ways. And during that conversation, he admitted something that changed my understanding of my mother permanently. He said his late father once described Diane Carter as terrified of being exposed and obsessed with appearances even when they were young. Suddenly, everything clicked together. My mother wasn't just protecting a marriage years ago. She was protecting the image she built afterward, the respected churchwoman, successful business owner, community leader persona that depended entirely on controlling how others perceived her. Wait until you hear what happened when the truth finally became public, because even I underestimated how quickly her social world would collapse once evidence replaced gossip. In June 2022, my cousin Tyler organized a large family reunion barbecue at a rented lakeside venue outside Asheville, intended partly to reconnect relatives after years of distance during the pandemic. And initially, I had no intention of attending because emotionally, I still hated conflict and public drama despite everything. But my father insisted the family deserved the truth directly instead of more rumors spreading privately behind closed doors. According to him, my mother planned to attend and present herself as the victim again before anyone else could. Explain the DNA results publicly. I spent nearly a week debating whether to go because the idea of facing relatives who ignored my suffering for 14 years filled me with anger, but eventually Natalie convinced me that silence would only protect the people who hurt me. She said something that stayed with me afterward. You already survived the humiliation once as a teenager. This time, you walk in with proof. The day of the reunion, I drove to Asheville wearing a dark blue business suit instead of casual clothes because psychologically I needed armor more than comfort. And when I arrived at the venue, almost every conversation stopped instantly. Some relatives looked embarrassed. Others looked guilty. A few genuinely seemed relieved to see me. My mother, however, looked furious the moment she saw me step out of the car beside my father, because for the first time in 14 years, she no longer controlled the narrative completely. She approached us immediately with this rehearsed emotional expression, pretending to cry, while accusing me of trying to destroy the family over private mistakes. And honestly, hearing that sentence flipped something inside me because suddenly I realized she still viewed herself as the victim even after everything she had done. So instead of arguing emotionally, I calmly opened my bag, removed printed copies of the DNA results, timeline records, and statements from the testing company, then handed them directly to several relatives standing nearby, including my Uncle David, Aunt Rebecca, and Cousin Tyler. The silence afterward felt suffocating because people were reading undeniable scientific proof while simultaneously realizing they helped humiliate an innocent teenager for years based entirely on my mother's lies. Then my father finally did something I never expected. In front of everyone, he admitted publicly that he failed me as a parent by choosing peace over truth and fear over courage. And seeing a 62-year-old man openly break down crying in front of relatives shocked the entire gathering because nobody had ever seen him challenge my mother publicly before. But the real destruction came moments later when Ethan Holloway unexpectedly arrived at the reunion after my father invited him privately, and the second people saw how strongly he resembled my mother physically. The remaining pieces of her story completely collapsed in real time. The moment Ethan Holloway stepped into that lakeside reunion venue, everything my mother spent decades protecting started crumbling so visibly that even people who previously defended her looked physically uncomfortable because denial becomes impossible when the truth is standing directly in front of you in human form. And I will never forget the expression on my mother's face when she saw him walking beside my father toward the family tables, because for the first time since I was a teenager, she looked completely powerless. Ethan wasn't loud or dramatic when he arrived. He didn't yell, accuse, or create a scene. Honestly, his calmness made the entire situation even more devastating because he simply introduced himself politely to relatives while holding copies of his own DNA analysis and old photographs connected to his late father. And within minutes, people started noticing obvious similarities between Ethan and my mother around the eyes, jawline, and smile that no emotional excuse could explain away anymore. Before I tell you what my mother admitted publicly that afternoon, you need to understand how strange family betrayal feels once everyone finally sees the truth. Because there's no satisfaction in watching people suddenly apologize after years of silence. There's mostly exhaustion, grief, and this painful awareness that your suffering could have been stopped much earlier if even one adult had chosen courage over comfort. Relatives who ignored me for years suddenly approached acting emotional and ashamed, including my Aunt Rebecca, who cried while apologizing repeatedly for not defending me sooner. And although part of me appreciated her honesty, another part kept thinking about 17-year-old Elena sitting alone at lunch tables while adults whispered behind her back instead of asking questions. My cousin Tyler looked genuinely furious at my mother after learning the full story because he realized his innocent comment years earlier about my resemblance to Grandpa William probably triggered her panic even more intensely, and several relatives admitted privately they always suspected something felt wrong but avoided confrontation because my mother controlled social dynamics inside the family through guilt, intimidation, and reputation management. But here's what none of us expected. My brother Mason completely lost control emotionally once Ethan arrived. Up until that moment, he had stayed mostly quiet near the edge of the gathering, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Probably because deep down he already understood our mother manipulated him too. But the second Ethan introduced himself, Mason exploded angrily, accusing my mother of destroying the family, lying to him his entire life, and turning him against his own sister for years just to protect herself. Watching my younger brother finally realize what happened was honestly heartbreaking because despite everything he said and did growing up, he was also raised inside the same toxic environment where loyalty to our mother mattered more than truth. He kept repeating, "You made me hate her for nothing," over and over again while relatives stood frozen around us. My mother initially tried denying everything again, claiming people misunderstood timelines and twisting facts emotionally the way she always had. But then Ethan quietly revealed something that completely shattered her remaining credibility. He explained that his late father kept old letters from my mother stored inside a box of personal documents after his death, and several of those letters referenced her fear that people will notice the baby looks too much like Robert's family, which directly connected to the adoption lie she later created years afterward. The second Ethan mentioned those letters, my mother's entire posture changed because she realized evidence now existed beyond DNA testing and family gossip. I remember the exact moment she finally stopped fighting because she sat down slowly at one of the picnic tables, looking suddenly older than I had ever seen her, then covered her face while everyone around her remained silent. And then, after 14 years of lies, humiliation, manipulation, and emotional destruction, my mother finally admitted the truth publicly. She confessed she invented the adoption story after years of paranoia surrounding her affair because she became terrified people would eventually question timelines, physical resemblance, and rumors connected to Ethan's biological father, especially after relatives repeatedly commented on how strongly I resembled the Carter side of the family instead of her. According to her own admission, she believed labeling me adopted would explain away any resemblance inconsistencies while also redirecting attention from herself. Entirely. But what made relatives react with genuine disgust wasn't only the lie itself. It was the fact that she knowingly sacrificed my identity, reputation, and emotional stability to protect her own image socially. Wait until you hear what happened after her confession, because that part changed my understanding of forgiveness permanently. Once the truth became undeniable, several relatives immediately turned against my mother publicly, including church friends who spent years praising her morality online. And within weeks, rumors spread through Asheville faster than anything I had ever seen, because people who once admired Diane Carter suddenly realized how thoroughly she manipulated everyone around her. Her real estate business started losing clients almost immediately after details leaked through social circles. Charity organizations quietly distanced themselves, and people who once defended her stopped returning calls. But strangely enough, watching her reputation collapse didn't bring me the satisfaction I expected for so many years. Instead, I mostly felt emotionally numb because no amount of public humiliation could give me back the childhood, confidence, and family trust she destroyed. The most difficult conversation happened later that evening when my father approached me privately near the lake after most relatives left, and through tears he admitted he planned to file for divorce because he could no longer ignore the damage caused by years of lies and cowardice. Then he asked me a question I never expected to hear from him. He asked whether someday I might allow him to try rebuilding a relationship with me honestly, without secrets or avoidance. And standing there beside the water watching sunset reflections move across the lake, I realized something important. Forgiveness does not mean pretending the damage never happened. It means deciding whether the future deserves a different ending than the past. The months following that reunion were emotionally complicated in ways I never could have predicted, because people assume exposing the truth automatically creates closure. But real life doesn't work like movie endings where one dramatic revelation suddenly heals years of damage. And honestly, there were mornings afterward when I still woke up angry, remembering specific humiliations from my teenage years, while other days I felt strangely guilty watching my mother lose almost everything she spent decades building, even though she created that destruction herself through lies and manipulation. My father officially filed for divorce 3 months after the reunion, moved into a smaller townhouse outside Charlotte to stay closer to me, and started attending therapy for the first time in his life, because according to him, the hardest part wasn't discovering my mother's affair. It was accepting how fear and passivity turned him into someone who abandoned his own daughter emotionally while pretending silence was the same thing as peace. Before I tell you where everyone ended up afterward, you need to understand one thing clearly, because this became the biggest lesson of my entire life. Family loyalty without accountability becomes emotional imprisonment. And for years, nearly everyone around my mother chose comfort over truth, because challenging her publicly felt inconvenient or uncomfortable, while I carried the consequences alone as a teenager, too young to defend myself properly. That realization changed how I viewed relationships permanently. I stopped romanticizing family connections simply because they shared blood and started paying attention instead to who acted with honesty, empathy, and courage when situations became difficult. Around late 2022, I met with Ethan in person for the first time at a quiet coffee shop near Knoxville, and despite the bizarre circumstances connecting us genetically, talking to him felt unexpectedly natural because both of us understood what it meant to grow up around secrets created by adults too selfish or afraid to tell the truth. Ethan explained that his own childhood carried confusion and emotional distance because his father avoided discussing the past almost entirely, and together, we slowly pieced together overlapping timelines that confirmed my mother spent years terrified that someone would eventually connect both families together publicly. The strange irony was that none of it would have destroyed our lives if she had simply told the truth decades earlier instead of building layer after layer of deception afterward. Instead, she transformed one mistake into years of emotional abuse, affecting multiple people across two families. Meanwhile, my brother Mason struggled badly after everything became public because once the shock faded, he had to confront the reality that he actively participated in humiliating me growing up, even if he was manipulated too. And for nearly 6 months, we barely spoke outside occasional awkward text messages until one night, he showed up unexpectedly at my apartment carrying an old cardboard box filled with childhood photos, school drawings, and birthday cards my mother apparently planned to throw away during the divorce process. I remember sitting on my living room floor going through those pictures while Mason apologized repeatedly for the things he said as teenagers. And although rebuilding trust takes time, that conversation became the first genuinely honest moment we ever shared as siblings without our mother controlling the emotional atmosphere around us. But here's the part nobody outside the family expected. My mother never truly apologized. Even after losing her marriage, business reputation, social standing, and relationships with relatives, she continued framing herself partly as the victim of private mistakes becoming public humiliation. And during our final conversation in early 2023, she actually told me she believed I should have handled the DNA results more discreetly to protect the family name. Hearing that sentence removed the last remaining guilt I carried, because suddenly I understood something fundamental about people like her. Some individuals care more about maintaining appearances than repairing harm, even after the truth destroys everything around them. That realization allowed me to stop waiting for closure from someone emotionally incapable of giving it. Over time, my life settled into something calmer and healthier than I once thought possible. I continued advancing professionally at Sterling Biotech Solutions, eventually helping launch a major healthcare distribution partnership that expanded operations across 4 states. While outside work, I slowly allowed myself to build genuine personal relationships without constantly expecting betrayal or rejection. Natalie got married and jokingly threatened to make me maid of honor whether I liked attention or not. Professor Daniel Harper retired from teaching but still sends me long motivational emails every few months, and my father gradually became part of my life again through small, consistent efforts instead of dramatic promises. Sometimes we meet for breakfast on Sundays and talk honestly about things we avoided for years. And although the past can never be erased, honesty at least gives people the chance to build something real afterward. Looking back now at the frightened 18-year-old girl leaving home with 2 duffel bags, I wish I could tell her one thing. The people destroying your confidence are not always telling the truth about who you are. Sometimes their cruelty is actually evidence of their own fear, shame, and dishonesty. My mother spent 14 years convincing everyone I was the problem because it distracted attention away from her own choices. But eventually reality caught up with the lies the way it always does. DNA didn't destroy my mother's life. Her own decisions did. And if there's one lesson I hope people take from my story, it's this. Protecting a false image at the expense of someone else's identity eventually costs far more than the truth ever would have in the beginning. So now I want to ask you something. If you discovered your own family had lied to you for years to protect someone's reputation, would you expose the truth publicly or keep quiet to avoid destroying the family? Let me know in the comments because honestly, I think more families hide painful secrets than most people realize. And if this story touched you in any way, subscribe for more real emotional storytelling about betrayal, survival, and rebuilding your life after the people closest to you let you down. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do isn't revenge. It's refusing to keep carrying someone else's lies.